Hello and welcome back to the latest installment of the Music History Project. Today we're celebrating the life and music of Buddy Holly. Welcome to the Music History Project. We're your hosts. I'm Elizabeth Dale.
And Dan Del Fiorentino.
And Mike Mullins.
All of our content comes from the Oral History Program, which is sponsored by NAMM, the National Association of Music Merchants. And that is a program that is over 3,000 interviews and constantly growing. If you want to check out any of our content or any of the other interviews that aren't featured, please check out our website at www.namm.org/library. All right, so this episode is dedicated to the music and life and career of Buddy Holly because... Anybody want to clue in our listeners?
Well, it's the 60th anniversary of the day that famous plane took off. Is that correct?
That's right. And as Don McLean said, the day the music died. And so we are commemorating the 60th anniversary as a celebration because his music and his legacy continues, as do the two other entertainers on that plane, which we'll talk about in this podcast, thanks to clips from the NAMM Oral History Program. We have several people who worked with, played with, and were influenced by Buddy Holly that we'll be talking about and playing their interview portions today during this podcast.
Yeah, and this is just a very small segment of the content that has to do with Buddy Holly. So if this is a topic that really fascinates you, or at the conclusion of this podcast you want more information, you can go onto our website and check out the tag for Buddy Holly and see a wealth of content, because it's a topic that Dan likes to discuss a lot because he was so influential. And they can do that where, Mike?
You can do that at www.namm.org. That's NAMM, NAMM.org/library.
And Mike, I thought it might be kind of a fun idea at the top of this podcast to just give the listeners an idea of the people that we are going to be including in today's podcast. Could you run down that list?
Sure. Some of the people we're going to hear from include Sonny Curtis, Eric Burdon, Tommy Rowe, Brian Setzer, Don McLean, and Danny White.
So for those Buddy Holly fans out there, I know that's a very impressive list. For those who are less familiar with those folks and their connection with Buddy, I think this is going to be a very intriguing podcast. So perhaps we should start off.
Yeah, so the way we typically structure these podcasts, if you've been listening in the past, is we kind of weave together everybody's story in a thematic format. So that way we tell the story from beginning to end. But we're going to change it up just a little bit because we have such diverse content from each of these guys. And so you're going to hear from each interviewee, and it's in the clips we've pulled in their entirety, and then we're going to shift to someone new. So the first person we're going to hear from today is Sonny Curtis. And I bet Dan has just a little bit of background information on him for us.
Well, Sonny played with Buddy, and we're going to be hearing those stories. But for those of you who are unfamiliar with his name, in addition to being a fantastic musician, he was also and is a songwriter. Some of the songs that Sonny has written over the years include the theme song to the Mary Tyler Moore TV show, which I know is now starting to be played in your heads. Yeah? No?
Nope.
And
nope. All I know is she was from Minneapolis, and she throws her hat in the air at the end.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
But that's more than I know, so.
Who can turn the world on with a smile?
Nope, still nothing.
Nothing? Oh. I'll sing it to you later. And I fought the law, but the law
won.
Very good.
I know that one.
Came in second.
So let's begin by hearing a little bit of Sonny Curtis and how he met Buddy.
A friend of mine that had gone to school with me in Meadow, he was actually my best friend all through my life, and he moved from Meadow to Lubbock, and he came down to Meadow on weekends, and he said, there are these two guys, Buddy Holly and Bob Montgomery, and they play at our assembly programs. And he said, I've told them about you, and they want to meet you. And I said, well, man, I'd love to meet them. And I had been on a couple of programs on TV. TV was brand new in Lubbock, but there was a guy named Bernie Howell who had an organ. He played the organ, and he had a show, 15 minutes every afternoon. And it was a long story, but I got mixed up with him, and he said, "I want you to do my show." And so I went on his show and sang a couple of songs. And so Buddy and Bob were familiar with me, But I remember one day it was a sandstormy afternoon, which is not unusual in Lubbock, Texas. But my friend and I, the one from Meadow, he and I went out to Bob Montgomery's house, and I can't imagine why I hadn't been in school, but he got off the school bus. His folks ran the Gin Cafe, which was out south of Lubbock, at a cotton gin. And he got off the bus, and he said, "We got to go over to Buddy's house." And so we jumped in the car and went over to Buddy's house. And I'll never forget, we didn't have any small talk. We just sort of met and got our guitars and went straight to the main thing, which was picking. And Buddy was kind of funny looking at the time. He had dyed his hair blonde, but it was growing out. He was black-headed, and he had dyed his hair blonde, and it was growing out. And I remember thinking that he looked kind of like a black and tan coonhound.
What was he playing at the time?
He played guitar, but he also, fortunately for me, they were big bluegrass fans, and he played. He had a 4-string banjo, and he could kind of, copy Earl Scruggs a little bit. And Bob Montgomery, I don't know if you know Bob, but he became a successful record producer and music publisher in Nashville, and also a terrific songwriter. Buddy played the banjo some, but he played guitar very well. And I played fiddle in the group, but I also played lead guitar some. And so we had a bass player named Larry Welborn, and then there was a guy named Don Guess who played bass and steel guitar. And we played for all the car lot openings and the grocery store openings, and just wherever we could go, And if somebody wanted to record us, man, we'd say, just wait till we get our guitars out.
All right, so that was Sonny Curtis talking about meeting Buddy Holly and Buddy playing the guitar and banjo and some other members of the Crickets, if I got that right.
You did.
Yeah,
Whew.
great job.
There's a lot of pressure.
No pressure. I think this might be a good opportunity to just give a little background on Buddy Holly and sort of get us up to date as to how his career got started. Buddy was born Charles Hardin Holly on September 7th, 1936 in Lubbock, Texas. And really very similar to Elvis, was influenced by 3 major styles of music, which he wound up combining. And that is music of the church, country, and Western music, which is very prominent on the radio in Lubbock, Texas, as you can imagine, and rhythm and blues. So unlike Elvis, Buddy Holly got on television as early as 1952 with his first television appearance. And in 1953, Buddy formed a duo with his buddy Bob Montgomery called Buddy and Bob. And again, this is all prior to Elvis. So very interesting early influence on rockabilly. Buddy Holly and Bob Montgomery were playing sort of a loose version of rhythm and blues and jump blues along with country music. Not quite yet in that same raw feeling of rockabilly, but certainly very close to it. He also opened for Elvis 3 different times in 1955 when young Elvis was still getting started before his big break in 1956. And interestingly enough, it was while Buddy Holly was opening for Bill Haley in the Comets, which you might remember had a big hit with Rock Around the Clock, considered to be one of the very first rock and roll hits on the charts. That was really when Buddy was discovered. And he was discovered by a guy named Eddie Crandall, who worked for the Decca Records company in Nashville. And the very famous record producer Owen Bradley was given the task to produce Buddy Holly. But it didn't work out too well. Buddy was not too happy with what Owen Bradley was doing with his music. He thought he was trying to make him more of a country singer and star. And so Buddy opted out of that and went back to a guy he had heard about before named Norman Petty, who had a recording studio in Clovis, New Mexico. And that's where Buddy did a demo on the thing called That'll Be the Day, which, of course, was, once it was released by Brunswick Records, became the very first big hit for Buddy Holly and the Crickets. So that was 1957. And now you're thinking, okay, 1957, his first hit came out. Remember, we're celebrating the 70th anniversary, or 60th anniversary, rather, of the day the music died. He didn't have a very long career, less than 3 years, really, on the top of the charts. So trying to put all this in perspective, in a very short period of time, we're now going to dedicate the rest of the podcast on the fact that rock and roll music was completely influenced by this guy. And the careers of many people, including the Animals and Don McLean and Peter Asher and on, the Beatles. John Lennon often said that Buddy Holly was his strongest influence. All these guys were influenced by this young guy wearing Hornwind glasses and his feet a little bowed, not the hippest guy in the class, but the common guy, the kid that looks a lot like you, as Peter Asher would tell us in his interview. This is a normal-looking kid, a little awkward, a little geeky, a little nerdy, and playing music and getting the girls, sort of winning everything. And that charm, along with that talent and the songwriting abilities and that special music, was really a major influence on rock and roll, which is one of the reasons Buddy Holly was among the very first inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame when they opened in 1986. So talk about an influence.
Whew, that was a lot. Very informative.
Sorry.
The best part is Dan didn't have any notes in front of him. No, just kidding. He did. So with that being said, we're going to kind of jump back to our interview here. We're going to hear more from Sonny Curtis. And we're going to start with him talking about playing the electric guitar before his first recording with Buddy. And we had this discussion a little bit earlier that I'm sure Mike is going to cut out and we're going to rework right here about, what did that really mean for rock and roll music, and what place in history did Sonny's playing the electric guitar with Buddy Holly and the Crickets, kind of how did that fit in the timeline of it all? And we came to the conclusion, thanks to Dan's expertise, that there were a lot of people doing this before Buddy Holly brought the electric guitar, such as, we said, Chuck Berry. We could probably name a couple more, I would imagine. Yeah,
well, Chuck was certainly the biggest influence on that, playing an electric guitar, for sure.
And so, but the difference is that Chuck Berry just didn't have many TV appearances, and we kind of equate that to the times and who was, quote unquote, allowed to be on TV versus who wasn't and all that jazz. And so Buddy Holly and his band had the opportunity to be on syndicated television, to be broadcast across the world, whereas people like Chuck Berry didn't always have that opportunity. And so that's where the difference is. People saw Sonny Curtis with Buddy Holly playing the electric guitar from their homes across the globe, which is why you have Sonny and Buddy being the influence as opposed to maybe Chuck Berry or others more widespread. In our interview with Graham Nash, he talks about being influenced by Buddy Holly. Well, if maybe he saw more of Chuck Berry, that would have been a different answer in his interview.
Absolutely. And I also think part of it has to do with the type of influence. Chuck Berry was certainly an influence on the style of playing, which you can pick up just by listening. And Buddy was more of the full package. He really allowed people to embrace their own style And even if they were a little shy or a little nerdy, or their hair didn't quite comb the right way, or they had horn-rimmed glasses, and they didn't look the part of like Elvis, sort of a superstar-looking kind of person, you could still be a rock and roll star. And I think that influence is really why it's more heartfelt, if that's the right way of saying it, with these musicians like Elton John and Bob Dylan, who have taken opportunities in acceptance speeches to make sure that they called out Buddy Holly as major influence on their lives, not just their music. And I think that is where we're at with the major influence on rock and roll, is that the kind of the whole package. I mean, he was writing songs, he was playing this Fender electric guitar and looking pretty cool, and performing with a very knockout band that had a great rhythm section. So this whole sort of full package of what the Crickets offered in 1957 was really new and different and embraceable. It didn't completely offend the parents because it was a nice kid from Lubbock. I think that's another part of it. So all of these elements really went into what we call the influence of Buddy Holly.
Yeah, I think it sounds like kind of the perfect storm of the right packaging at the right time and the right exposure.
Plus, we got to emphasize these amazing songs. I mean, they're really fun songs to listen to. I mean, even today, it's so fun to hear a recent band cover things like Not Fade Away. That's a great tune, and it has been covered nearly every decade that I know of by a new band, and it still stands up. Rave On, another one. It's So Easy, Heartbeat, and my uncle's favorite song, Maybe Baby, which I probably have heard a million zillion times. And that's in addition to his biggest hits, which of course were Oh Boy, Peggy Sue, and That'll Be the Day. So an amazing catalog of songs that were fun to play and listen to, and as these young musicians, many of which we're talking about today, who are influenced by them, wanted to play in their garage and in their basement and in their bedroom to try to be like Buddy Holly.
So let's turn it back over to Sonny, talking about playing the electric guitar as well as touring, recording, coming home, and all that went into working with Buddy.
I had a Martin D28, and Norman Petty had a trio, the Norman Petty Trio, and they had some hit records with Mood Indigo, and then Norman wrote a song called Almost Paradise, and they were big hit records, but they were real pop. This would have been like in the 54, 55 era. And but Jack Vaughn, who played guitar for Norman Petty, his wife got pregnant, and he was going to leave the group, and Norman Petty offered me the job. And I remember I went over to discuss it with him, and I said, I don't have an electric guitar. And Norman said, don't worry about that. We'll get you an electric guitar. I came home and told the money was so great, man, to me at the time. It seemed like it was $150 a week, and they were going to give me a very small percentage, or whatever. Anyway, I came home, and I called Buddy, and I said, man, I can't, because we weren't doing any good at the time. and even though we'd had a record out, like that, we thought, oh, man, we're on Decca. All we got to do is have a record out, man, and we'll be hot in no time. We'll be Elvis before you know it. Of course, we had a lot to learn. One of the first ones is, no, not necessarily. But I called Buddy on the phone, and I said, Buddy, man, this is just too good a deal for me to turn down, man. I'm going to do this. And Buddy said, don't do this, man. Don't go off out there and play that Mickey Mouse music. You're going to hate that, man. And I said, well, he said he'd buy me a guitar. And Buddy said, I'll buy you an electric guitar. Anyway, so he convinced me. I called Norman and took a big pass, and didn't go. And it's funny, but Norman Petty never liked me from that day forward. He's the kind of guy that you didn't turn down, man. And but anyway, that's all ancient history. Real ancient history.
Did you regret that? Or did you
No. Right? Oh no, I never regretted not going to Norman Petty. But I was with Buddy probably another year, and then we had our parting of the ways, friendly, actually, but I got a job to go on the road with Slim Whitman, and I took that job, and I've always told people that we were sort of, when I was in the group, I sort of played Scotty Moore style, because Chet Atkins was my idol, man, and when I got that lick, that's all I ever did, and so I played, Scotty Moore type stuff, and when I've always told people that we were sort of Elvis clones, because we did, Buddy, he played that my D28, and I played his Stratocaster, and Don Guest played that slap bass that kind of like Bill Black, and it's funny, when we saw Elvis for the first time, we started booking out the next day, man. And Baby, Let's Play House, and That's All Right, Mama, and everything. We had it down. And anyway, that's when we kind of parted ways, and I went on the road with Slim Whitman. Then Buddy started playing lead guitar himself, and he developed that really hard rock and roll, rhythmic lead style, and so I'm not taking credit now, but it was when he started playing lead guitar that, and then Jerry Allison, who's a great drummer, he started. I remember they played together, just the two of them, at the roller rink in Lubbock. And, man, they just got to where they could feel what each one was going to do, and they were terrific together. And so that's kind of how we got together and got partied and all that.
So once again, we are hearing from Sonny Curtis about his time with Buddy Holly. Next up, we're going to hear a little bit more from him, talking about Buddy being influenced by Elvis, as well as the needing to get a drummer, the songs that Buddy wrote and that Sonny wrote, as well as writing for the Crickets and the band ultimately splitting up.
Did Buddy talk to you about watching Elvis and being influenced by him at all?
Oh, I don't know if we talked about it. Oh, well, we talk about Elvis all the time. I mean, Buddy and Elvis actually hung out together a little bit. But we went to all the shows when Elvis came to town, and there was a picture I saw in the magazine you showed me that picture was taken April the 10th of 1956, and we were opening for Elvis. I'm not saying we were opening, but we were on the show. Dave Stone used to put us on wherever he could because we were freebie, and it's really funny because, like, I'm playing Buddy's Stratocaster, and Buddy is playing Elvis's D18. Elvis had a D18 at the time, and it's really funny because, like, Buddy fooled around during that performance we did and broke a string, and Bill Black had to replace that string, and he was quite put out with Buddy. When we first saw Elvis, he didn't have a drummer. They just relied on Bill Black's percussive bass style. And that's why we got a drummer, which was J.I., because Buddy said, well, Elvis has got a drummer. We got to have one, So, and I'll never forget when we first saw J.I., he was playing in the high school band, and they were practicing for a football game. And Buddy and I pulled up and parked in his folks' car, and they were just coming to the end of their practice for the football game that week. And J.I. came running over to the car, and J.I. hadn't reached his growth spurt yet, and he was really kind of short, And I thought, surely he can't. Surely we're not going to get him to play drums for us. But anyway, we did.
The one thing I'm not sure about is, did Buddy ever play or record any of your tunes that you wrote?
One song called "Rock Around with Ollie V," and that was the first trip. Well, not the first trip to Nashville. We did it, and I think we made 4 trips down here. Buddy made one trip that I wasn't in the group, but we came down about 3 or 4 times to record for Decca, and he recorded "Rock Around with Ollie V," which is a song I wrote, and that's the only one that he ever got around to recording. Of course, he wrote so many songs that, he didn't really need me to write songs for him. Buddy and the Crickets split, and I'm not going to guess why, but I mean, like J.I. got married and Buddy Holly got married. J.I. married Peggy Sue of Peggy Sue fame, and Buddy married Maria Elena, who was a New York City girl, and it all happened about the same time. And Buddy wanted to move to New York City because he had a little more vision. He thought that would be the place to be if you're going to pursue a career in music, much better than Lubbock, Texas. But Joe B., or the bass player, Joe B. Malden, and J.I., they didn't want to move to New York, so they had a kind of a friendly split, and J.I. called me and asked if I would join the group again, and this would have been, I'm guessing around, early fall of 1958, and you see, Buddy died on February 3rd of 1959, so they had split, and he lived in New York, and I went back with the group, and we had a terrific singer named Earl Sinks who took Buddy's place kind of as the lead singer, and we started trying to book out, but not having much luck. But we did have an album that we to do for the Crickets, but then Buddy died, and we were sort of rudderless for a while, and we went to New York I think it was in July of '59, and recorded In Style with the Crickets. And then the Everly Brothers called because they had a situation where they were going on the road and hiring pickup bands in various towns, and they'd pass out their music. And they just had some disasters. And one night this was before Buddy died, they were in Florida, and Buddy and J.I. and Joe B. Were on the show with Don and Phil, and of course they were all good friends. And Don and Phil said they couldn't get a band together, And Buddy said, "We know all your stuff. We'll play with you, And they evidently backed the Everly Brothers, and it just went down a storm, and the Everly Brothers all of a sudden got it. They said, "Forget pickup bands, man." But anyway, they called J.I. and said that they'd like for him to and Joe B. to come play with them. And J.I., I had met the Everly Brothers, but I didn't know them that well at the time. And J.I. said, "Well, the only way we'd do it is if you'll take our guitar player, Sonny." And so they said, "Okay." And so I played that time around for about a year with the Everlys, with the Crickets, and then I got drafted, of course, going into the Army.
All right, so that concludes our section with Sonny Curtis, and hopefully he has the opportunity out there to listen to this podcast. It'd be a real treat.
Absolutely.
And next we're going to move on to our second guest. Who wants to do the honors of introducing him?
So next up, we're going to hear from Eric Burdon, who is the lead vocalist for a group called The Animals, which you may have heard of. And he was heavily influenced by Buddy Holly. And Dan, when you sat down with him, he had a lot of good things to say about Buddy.
I was really impressed by the opportunity that we had to sit down with Eric, But in addition to that, how cool it was that he took so much of the time of his own interview where he could be talking about his own career. He wanted to make sure that he talked about Buddy Holly. So let's play that segment.
I met him on the street in Newcastle when I was a kid. There was, I don't think the Crickets were with him, maybe they were. But he was walking down the street, he and Sam Cooke were on the same show together at the City Hall in Newcastle, and they were out in the early afternoon, must have been shopping, and they were walking down the main street, and well, you're Americans, aren't you? And you went, you know, how do you know? I said, but the way you dress, nobody has gabardine overcoats, white raincoats like that, And I got into this chat about the clothing. I didn't realize it was Buddy Holly. I had a feeling it was Sam Cooke. But just on Main Street, and that memory stayed with me for a long time. But I love Buddy Holly's recordings. I have some now that I play because they're very mysterious in their content, but very, very music and light too. I was at somebody's local party just recently, and they had a sound system set up, and it was obvious they were going to want me to sing. And I really don't like that. If they're going to invite me to a party, but the pressure was on me. But the great thing is that there's this guitar player who was a big Buddy Holly fan. So I just said to him, look, I'm being pressured to get up. I've got to do a song. Do you know That'll Be the Day or Peggy Sue or whatever? But because I did an imitation of Buddy's voice, and it was a great experience because in that little 2 songs that I did, I think I did, what did I do? Anyway, I got right on the microphone. I had the microphone right down my mouth almost, and I was singing very quietly and very the little things you say and do make me want to be with you. And the audience were like, yeah, fantastic, it worked. And for me, it was like such a cheap shot, just getting up and imitating the voicings of the Buddy Holly band. And it was a great experience. I'll have to remember it and do it more. But but their recordings, I could never figure out where the backbeat came from. It was there, but it was very pop, pop. It sounded like they were playing on a stack of books or a couple of phone directories. It didn't sound like it was hitting the skin, but it worked. Fascinated me. It was great, and his recordings to me were power without being brutal, without being noisy, and very, very personal, very lovely. I mean, lovely stuff. Really great band.
Do you remember where you were when you heard that he died?
Yeah, I stepped out of a bar, hamburger joint in upstate New York, and there was one of the boxes that distributes newspapers outside, and it just had headlines about the airplane crash, the big bopper, and all of that. And I went, wow. It was the first death in the music industry that I felt was personal to me. I was like, wow. And, it was like a foretelling of the future, because now, every week now it seems that somebody I knew personally is gone. Like this week it was John Hurt, the actor, who was a big fan of mine, and I really liked him a lot. and I really loved the way you that croaking voice, and his, But the thing is to get that croaking voice character and be slim through his life like he was, really fine-boned. He was a smoker, constant, lighting one cigarette off another cigarette. So it was the cancerous kind of vowels that were coming out of him. And he made it work for him. Leonard Cohen did too. Lenny's voice was almost on the point of disappearing, and the engineers managed to get it, hold it up so that, and it's just so. That's the test in the recording, but the test for the listener is like the journey that his voice is putting you through, because you have an old soul singing with an old voice, it really gets to you,
So that was Eric Burdon talking about Buddy Holly, and interestingly enough, several folks that we've interviewed over the years took time out of their interview to make sure that they had a shout out to Buddy Holly. And I think that's what we're going to be hearing in the next couple of segments here as part of this podcast as we remember the day the music died 60 years ago, February 3rd, 1959. So that was Eric Burdon's take on it. And coming up, we're going to also be hearing from Tommy Rowe.
Well, he was a huge influence on my music. Of course, you would never know it by listening to Sheila, right? But the original version of Sheila was just regular 2/4 drums. So it was Felton's idea to take off on Buddy with the drums in Sheila, which worked. I think it worked. In fact, some people used to call in and thought it was an old Buddy Holly thing out of the can, especially in England when it was a hit in England. But he was very influential. I hooked up as a kid with singer-songwriters, which at that time nobody called them singer-songwriters. They just wrote their own music. They didn't have really a tag to it. But Buddy Holly was one, Carl Perkins, Chuck Berry, of course, wrote all of his own material. So, but Holly was the big influence. I used to mimic him with my band. All of our friends loved Buddy Holly, Peggy Sue. We used to do all of his songs in our show. That'll Be the Day. Peggy Sue, Ray Vaughan, you name it. I'm saving my money. No, not that one, but what's the song I used to do? Da-da-da-da-da. But it's raining in my heart. I used to do that in my show all the time. I'm 75, so it's kind of hard for me to recollect back that far. It's a long time. I just turned 75, by the way, last Tuesday, May 9th. Happy birthday. 75 years young. I'm genuinely certified old fart now, so ready for the geezer circuit. But yeah, they were very. Sam Cooke was another. I used to love Sam because he wrote his own music. And when I was a kid, I was really shy. I never dreamed about being on stage performing my songs. I thought I'll write songs and present them to other people and have artists do them. I had this big vision of people doing my music. But it didn't, that wasn't my fate. I ended up being the singer of my hit, so that's the way it worked for me. But I've done the Clear Lake, Iowa show several times, probably 6, I think either 5 or 6 times. That's where Buddy, the plane crashed. They do a show every year in February on that date, and I've done that show many times. I've been inducted into the Iowa Rock and Roll Association Hall of Fame because I've worked there so much. The Iowans and the Midwesterns really took to my music because of my influence with Holly, and he had such a big following in the Midwest through Iowa and Nebraska, Minnesota, South Dakota, and so I've worked up there a lot because of that.
So you were at the Surf Ballroom?
Oh, it's Surf Ballroom, yeah.
Yeah, tell me about that place.
Yeah. Oh, it's nostalgic. It's great. I did it the last time I think it was 3 years ago. It's always cold there. It's just like you picture Holly's Plain in the snow. That's the way it is every time I go there. It's just freezing cold and snow, really high on the ground. I actually got stranded there one year. We couldn't get out. I worked there with Bobby V, and Bobby had his van, and we tried to leave the next morning, and we couldn't get out of town because the snow was so high. So we had to stay. We were stranded in this place for like 3 days. all the fans were there sleeping in the hallways. I mean, it was a mess. It was a mess, but it's quite a great show. They do a great job in that ballroom. Very few ballrooms left. You know, when I first started, you could do a whole tour with just ballrooms in the Midwest. And that was really the way I learned to perform, was doing these ballroom shows. And so the Surf is one of the few that's left, and they still celebrate. It's not really a celebration, it's kind of a memorial every year for the three artists who lost their lives.
Had you ever been to Lubbock?
I've been to Lubbock many times, yeah. Well, I say many times, maybe 3 or 4 times. I've done shows there. You know, they have a celebration there with the Holly thing as well. That was one thing when I worked with the Beatles. They had a lot of questions about Buddy Holly because they used to do, the Beatles were originally a cover band. I mean, they used to do Sheila in their show. When I first met the Beatles, I never will forget, we had before the tour started, the promoter brought us in together to rehearse with the band, and the Beatles came, introduced us, the featured acts on the show and everything. When I saw them, I thought, boy, that's some backup band we have. I thought they were actually our backup band. So anyway, when I first met them, they just had tons of questions about Buddy Holly. And, John said, we do Sheila in our show, and we've been doing it at the Star Club in Hamburg, and people love it. But he said, I'm not sure if we're playing it correctly. So he got his guitar and he played it. And sure enough, he was playing the chords backwards. It goes A, E, D, and they were playing A, D, E. And I said, yeah, you just got to flip the chords around. It goes to E before the D. And they said, yeah, I know, it didn't sound right. I don't know if you've heard that crude recording of Sheila that somebody made in the Star Club. And sure enough, they're playing all over the place. You can't tell what they're playing. I guess it was those quick changes from the chords, back and forth. But, that was a moment. They wanted to know about if I'd met Buddy Holly. And, of course, I didn't. I was still in high school, and I'd never met him, never saw him perform. But when that was another moment when he was killed in that plane crash. We were in school, and I used to work in a where they sold food and snacks in school during recess and lunch. It's called the Shakedown, and I used to work behind the counter selling stuff. And it came over the radio that Buddy's plane had gone down. And that was another one of those moments, But he influenced everybody. He influenced the Beatles. I mean, the Beatles got their name because the Crickets are taken, so we'll be the Beatles. I don't know if you heard that story or not. That's how they got their name. They said, we can't be the Crickets, so we're going to be the Beatles.
That's awesome. Did you see Buddy on the Ed Sullivan Show?
I did, yes. Yeah, I was still in high school.
I was thinking because that was the Stratocaster.
Yeah, that's why I bought the Strats, I mean, I loved that whole thing. I mean, he was so, with the horn rim glasses and the whole thing, and the way he moved. He moved well, for a rockabilly. He was considered a rockabilly artist. And I never will forget that black and white, Ed Sullivan. Black and white. We went from black and white to color overnight.
All right, that was Tommy Rowe talking about the influence of Buddy Holly on his career. And we're going to move it right along to hearing from Brian Setzer talking about seeing Buddy Holly's photo up in Manny's up in New York City, and kind of how the impact that left on him.
Or to go to Manny's or something on 48th Street, that was the big thing. To go to Manhattan, and actually get into those shops, that was a little less personal because there was real, it was a real music store with guys coming in and out buying stuff. And but yeah, that was a big deal to actually do all of that. That was a great memory. That's cool. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Yeah.
I remember Manny's with all the pictures, right?
Yeah.
Everybody else who's been in there.
They had a picture of Buddy Holly, autographed with a Strat. I remember seeing that going, even then thinking it was special. Wow, look at this, Buddy Holly bought a Strat here. I think it was the one that he really used, the 58, I think it was. I think he got it at Manny's.
It's incredible.
Yeah. Awesome.
I think the coolest thing about this podcast is it's showing how no matter how big the star is that you're interviewing, Dan, whenever you bring up Buddy Holly, they all seem to back down and say, oh, well, that's the greatest. Like, no one's ever going to top that. And they're all just like crazy influenced by him. It just kind of shows how much power he had in that little time that he was performing.
That's what I find so fascinating is today, a career of 3 years, you're not going to you rarely find someone that has that much influence 30, 40, 50 years later.
Right, yeah.
But 3 years back then, I don't know, that's just, it's insane.
Right. And it really, to me, I've thought about this a couple of times growing up myself. I'm in the era of American Pie. I was a young kid when that came out, and almost Buddy Holly was mythical at that point. He didn't really exist on the planet kind of thing. He was such an icon in that respect. But I think what's held up and why these musicians are still talking about him and why he's still influencing younger musicians is the body of work. When it comes down to it, it's all about the song, they always say in music publishing, right? Well, I think about the legacy of somebody like him, it's all about the music and really what did he give us. And I wish that legalities in the world would allow us to play some of his music, because that's really what this is all about, is what he gave us musically. So hopefully this will inspire some of our listeners to get their hands on some of the music of Buddy Holly and some of the songs that we talked about earlier, because that's really why we're talking about him today, is what he gave us musically.
Who are we going to hear from next?
Sorry. When I stop, I just stop. Huh?
Yeah, it's like done. Brain shut down.
Commercial
No
break.
more.
We'll be right back.
Sorry.
So next we're going to be hearing from Don McLean.
Well, he was about 13 years old. He had a paper route, and in 1959, he threw the newspapers out to his neighbors' doorsteps with this bad news that Buddy Holly and a guy named the Big Bopper, who had a big hit called Chantilly Lace, and a very young kid from Southern California named Richie Valens, all passed away in an airplane crash. And so Don was very, very influenced by that, as many people were. So the demise of Buddy Holly and the impact that his music had on people, and just sort of the sheer horror of the fact that this young artist, three of them, who are at the top of this rock and roll craze, and it's rebellious and it's exciting and it's social and it's all those wonderful things when you're a young kid, and then to have the reality of life just slap you in the face was a tremendous shock to people, to the point where Don called it the day the music died. And I know a lot of people were kind of shocked by that, but in some respects, and in listening to the lyrics and reading the lyrics that Don has in that song American Pie, which came out in 1971, you can really see and feel what that impact was. And I asked if Elizabeth could be so kind as to read the first couple of lines of that song. Would you mind?
Read? Sing? Oh, no.
Yeah, we need the whole show.
Yeah.
Let's get a band in here.
Yeah,
It's only an
laser
8-minute
lights
song.
and-
You can do it.
Yeah. Uh-huh. All right, so we'll do a dramatic reading. No. I have to try not to sing it. A long, long time ago, I can still remember how the music used to make me smile, and I knew if I had my chance that I could make those people dance, and maybe they'd be happy for a while. But February made me shiver with every paper I'd deliver. Bad news on the doorstep, I couldn't take one more step. I can't remember if I cried when I read about his widowed bride. Something touched me deep inside the day the music died. So bye-bye, Miss American Pie. Drove my Chevy to the levee, but the levee was dry. And them good old boys were drinking whiskey and rye, singing, "This'll be the day that I die. This'll be the day that I die." That was very difficult to not sing.
So let's go right into Don's interview, where he's talking about his Buddy Holly's influence on his career.
I was always different. And so his music spoke to me. And lots of other music spoke to me, but Buddy Holly's death, at the time when I was really listening very carefully to a lot of the early albums, the first 2 or 3 that he made. He didn't make that many records. That had a powerful impact on me. And you know, it is when you're young and something dies, you know, an animal or a friend or a parent or a sister or a brother. God, is the worst thing on earth. And as you get older, you get harder and you get used to it. I mean, people die every month now, you know, and I don't even think about it anymore. I mean, I'm sorry, but it's me next, you know. But then it's not. You know, you're always trying to stave this off. And so Buddy was a personal thing when it happened to me. And as for his influence, well, you can never know what the influence of great music and great records is going to be. You know, it's like Joe DiMaggio, when he was at the end of his career, 50, something around 1950, whatever. He played hard, and someone asked him why. He said, because someone may never have seen me before, and I want them to see me, you know, at my best. Standards. So when you build in standards to recordings and to beautiful songs, you do not know where the influence of those are going to end. So 20 years from now, somebody might hear a Buddy Holly song and form a group that was better than the Beatles ever was. Or even hear a song by me, you know, and decide they want to be the greatest singer-songwriter that ever lived, eclipsing Dylan and everybody. You do not know this. That's why it's so important to put your best work out. Never compromise. And people are always trying to get you to compromise because they don't understand. It's not their fault. They want to help you, but we don't need help. You know, you just need to be left alone so you can do what you need to do and make it the best thing that you can do. And I think he had that period of time there when he was in a little zone with the Crickets and Norman Petty and those people, and they all had a little thing working, and he was writing these wonderful songs, and Norman Petty understood how to make really good records, and that sounded really wonderful and did a great job for him. This is before George Martin, you know. I mean, he was important, Norman Petty.
It seems to me that you really pushed the limits on a lot of things, and one of the things that keeps coming up to my mind is American Pie and just the length of it. I mean, that alone, I think, changed the way a lot of people were doing records. Do you see it that way?
Well, the song had to, I had to tell a story, and it took that long to do it. That's how I saw it. You know, if I could have told it in a shorter period of time, I probably would have. But and I never intended it to be a hit. I mean, you don't intend things like that. It was a phenomenon, and a good record was made. The producer I had was an amateur, basically, but he successfully did a few things right, but he wasn't consistent. And because there were so many different kinds of things that I did, I do many different kinds of things. George Martin would have worked very well with me because he would have gone with so many different approaches that I had, and not said, oh, this is a Don McLean song, that isn't. And that's the problem you run into as an artist.
I mean, I even remember, obviously the song came out in 1971. I was not alive. Mm-mm. Mike was definitely not alive.
Well, I was a little kid.
Dan was a wee young one. 4. But that's a song I heard growing up. I mean, my parents played it in the car, and I'm sure your parents did too. Mm-hmm. I mean, you still hear it when you go out now.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
It's in heavy rotation.
Yeah, it's just one of those songs, you know, where it's like, I'm sure there's a lot of people that don't really know where it came from or what it's about. Right. And it's just a song that you've always heard.
But you typically hear people humming along to it or singing along to it. It's just, it's well known. Mm-hmm. You know, it's, you know, I don't want to use the word like a new standard or whatever, but it's hard pressed to find someone who doesn't know at least the chorus. Mm-hmm. And I think that plays heavily on, obviously it's catchy and it's written very well, but I would like to say it has a lot to do with the content, the story behind it. Mm-hmm.
Plus, there's a lot of meaning in there. I mean, when we interviewed Don, one of the things his manager said we couldn't interview him about is the lyrics of that song. So we couldn't specifically ask, okay, what does this mean? What does that mean? There's all kinds of different things. There's references to Elvis and Bob Dylan and all kinds of things going on in that song that would be great to get very clear clarification. But I think part of Don's message in not addressing all these specifics is it should be up to us as the listeners to determine what it is and what it means to us. But what's clear is the influence, and what's clear is those early lines that Elizabeth wrote. I mean, Buddy got married just 6 months before. So that line about his widowed bride, I mean, it sends chills up and down your back. This was not just an icon like I grew up thinking Buddy Holly was. He was a real guy, and there was a real person that was left behind. In fact, in kind of a very somber thing, one of the things that's been coming out in recent years is the correlation between when Maria Ella had her miscarriage of just a couple of months. I think she was pregnant only 2 months. The shocking news that she heard over the radio and television broadcasts changed the way law enforcement now tell the next of kin. Now, was that the only one? Probably not. But because of that dramatic thing that happened in her life that was clearly related to how she heard the news, there's now a different way that law enforcement inform people. So that to me really is that's heartbreaking, isn't it? That to me takes Buddy Holly out of the clouds of this iconic rock star to a guy. He was going to be a dad, and he was just newly married. So those kind of things that appear in things like American Pie bring the reality of this person into light. And along with that, I think what I really appreciate is the clip that Elizabeth saved to the end of our podcast, and that is from Danny White, who reflects on what Buddy Holly might have been if his life was allowed to continue. And I think those are the elements that make me ponder his influence. It's great to dream about, wow, it would be neat if, he was still here and things like that. But I think it's amazing to look at his list of influence and the body of work that he provided us and say, wow, he's still here. 60 years later, it doesn't really seem that long ago when you think that his music is still very vibrant. And as Mike brought up, and so often talked about in these interviews that we conduct. I don't necessarily bring up the topic, it comes up. And I think that's another part of the influence of Buddy Holly.
I think that Buddy would have been one of the greatest record producers of all time. He was very, very intelligent as far as his music goes and what he wanted to do. Very few people realize how good he was with the equipment. He was building a studio. The drawings, Peggy Sue put the drawings out in her book of his studio in Lubbock. All drawn out, was ready to go. They were already getting ready to break ground when he died. So I think what people don't realize about Buddy is how intelligent he was in regard to the music business. He had already started a company called Prism Records, which was a record label. He started that with Norman Petty and Ray Ruff. And so he did that in late '58 before he moved to New York City with Maria Elena and Greenwich Village. So I think that most people see him as the skinny kid with the horn-rimmed glasses and, influencing all those great bands, but what he could have done, really. I mean, he's the guy who found Waylon Jennings, of course. He's the guy who made the first recording on Waylon Jennings, Jolie Blonde, and that was Prism Records' first recording at Norman Petty's studio in October or November of '58. So, yeah, I think that would be what people probably miss about him. He personally got King Curtis to come to Clovis to record Reminiscing, which he gave to King Curtis as a gift. He gave him the song. So, flew him into Lubbock, brought him up to Clovis, and they recorded a couple tracks. So, yeah, he definitely had that. Early on, I mean, Bob Montgomery and Buddy, they wanted to be Flatt and Scruggs. That was there. That's what they wanted to be. And if you listen to a lot of that early Buddy and Bob, the really close harmonies, it's all in the way they go about their song structures is very much that. But he was obviously a big fan. A lot of people don't realize that Buddy Holly and the Crickets were one of the very, very first white groups to break the racial barrier on tour. They were playing the theater in D.C. with name escapes me now, but the big black theater in Washington D.C. with Clyde McPhatter and all those guys. This was early on. This is on that tour where they got. This would have been the 57 Tour of Stars, I believe is what they called it. And they were on that tour, black acts and white acts on the same bus, and they got to Louisiana, and the state police met them at the border and said, whites and blacks aren't playing on the same stage. And so they had to actually get off the tour. And that's how Buddy Holly got sent to the Air Force Base up in Oklahoma City, Tinker Air Force Base, and that's where they recorded Maybe Baby, Oh Boy, Rock Me My Baby, while they were told to leave the tour for a few days on the small little Ampex 401A that I used to own with the estate. So he was very, very out front in regard to race and rock and roll. Little Richard, he was touring with Little Richard and all that. So people don't realize that about those guys.
So that was Danny White, and this concludes our podcast on Buddy Holly, reflecting on the life and legacy that was his body of work in a very short career, on what will be his 60th anniversary of his death. Maybe a little closing thought from each? I don't know. What do you guys think?
Well, one thought I wanted to just bring out there is, two other performers passed away on that plane, and we mean no disrespect by not spending a lot of time talking about them. Obviously, their memory is still alive and still with us as well. And the second thought I wanted to leave with you is something we brought up earlier, which is it's about the music. So maybe you guys can all do us a favor and get your hands somehow, however you listen to music, go play some. Go play some Buddy Holly today. Mike? Yeah, I'm sure there's something coming out for the 60th anniversary, music-wise, some sort of collection. But yeah, same thing. It was such a short amount of time, but the music that came out was so amazing. It's just totally worth a listen. If you've never been into Buddy Holly, or it's just not really your style of music, I still encourage you to go check it out, because you're probably going to know most of the songs, as most people realize that they didn't know that they knew them. They're just it's just such good songwriting, and I guess I'll leave it at that.
And I think I'll go with the breadth of people who were influenced by him is just overwhelming, and I would suggest doing some research into that to see if any of your favorite artists were heavily influenced by Buddy. But it'll be interesting to see 60 years from now who else comes out and credits him as the reason why they picked up a guitar or started singing or writing. So thanks for joining us. We'll see you guys in 2 weeks. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.